Welcome to this fifth section in the Ethics in Education module for EDN 3200. Today we'll be looking at the South African Council of Educators Code of Conduct. After doing some really heavy lifting in sections 1 to 4, things are going to get a little bit easier from here, although I will admit that the Code of Conduct itself is on the dry side. In this section, we'll look at the Sace Code of Conduct, but I'm sure that after section 4 you're feeling a little skeptical about codes of conduct, and that's okay. I wanted you to approach this with a critical eye, recognizing that it is more about the bureaucracy of schools than actually a guide that will tell you how to resolve ethical dilemmas. In section 6, the next section, we'll then look at some of the everyday dilemmas, some of which are fictional and some of which are real, and try and consider critically what the Code of Conduct says, what our ethical imaginations and moral conscience might tell us, and where our beliefs about the right thing come from, how they play out at scale and over time. Okay, let's look at this code then. There are two parts to the Sace Code of Conduct. The first contained 8 core areas and addresses the general conduct of educators or teachers, and also specific conduct in relation to teachers with learners, with parents or caregivers, the broader community, with colleagues, with the profession at large, with their employer, which is either the provincial education department or the school's governing body, and with the Sace itself. The second part lays out in detail the processes to be followed in the situation that a teacher is accused of violating this code of conduct, and includes 10 areas which overall can be described as the general purpose of disciplinaries, the functions of a disciplinary committee, how investigations into breaches should be handled, the structure and procedures of disciplinary hearings and committees, how recommendations from committees and panels should be handled, and how to manage appeals. It does all kind of read a bit like legalese. Our main focus today is on the first part, the actual code. However, I would strongly recommend that you at least read once the second half regarding disciplinary procedures. Now, you probably think you don't need to. You probably would say, nah, don't worry, I'm never going to be up on a disciplinary. But, unfortunately, this is not a sensible approach. You never know what a student, colleague, employer, or parent may say, even if it's not true or it's based on a misunderstanding. To know your rights and the appropriate processes is a sensible defense against any accusations laid against you, whether mistaken, malicious, or otherwise. Think of it as insurance. You don't buy life insurance assuming you're going to die tomorrow. You don't buy car insurance thinking that you're going to have an accident when you drive off tomorrow morning. But you get it anyway, because you just never know. Forewarned is forearmed, and there is no harm in being prepared for the unpleasant and the unexpected. I wish I could say that people always make accusations of misconduct in good faith, but I'm afraid it's just not true. As I mentioned in section 4, it never ceases to amaze me the stories I hear from junior and newly qualified teachers about conflicts and how they are resolved in schools. So please read this second section of the code, and the Employment of Educators Act too. I want to draw your attention to clause 5.5 from the disciplinary procedures section. It says, an educator charged with an alleged breach of the code is entitled to representation, and that may include representation by a union, a fellow employee, or a legal representative at any disciplinary hearing. And when you read the section on disciplinaries, you'll see that they echo a lot of the basic structure of court cases or the CCMA. There's appeals, there's evidence, there's witnesses, examinations and cross-examinations, etc., etc. In short, it's a legal technical minefield, and representing yourself if you are not clued up with all the ins and outs of every act, legislation and framework will be incredibly risky and difficult. If you are not a trained lawyer or legal expert, this is probably territory that you don't want to step into. And this is why you need to join a union. They will automatically appoint a qualified representative for you in the event that you find yourself in a labour dispute. That's their job. For a retainer of R106.10 a month, which is the 2020 fee currently, I promise it's well worth it. It's certainly cheaper than hiring a private lawyer, and it really doesn't matter which union you choose. Rather, like insurance, it's the peace of mind knowing that if you're in a dispute, you're not completely on your own against the school or the provincial education department, who I promise will definitely have lawyers and experts on their team. Okay, so on to the actual details of the code itself. We will see, as we step through each part, that the definitions are open to interpretation, and that this is both a positive and a negative. We'll think through a few of the clauses and how they give gaps for teachers to fill in their own understanding of what is ethical. Part 1 is just definitions about what an educator is, what a learner is, etc. So the part that we start with is actually the second part and refers to the general conduct of teachers. It says that educators who are registered or provisionally registered with the South African Council for Educators acknowledge the noble calling of their profession to educate and train the learners of our country, acknowledge that the attitude, dedication, self-discipline, ideals, training and conduct of the teaching profession determine the quality of education in this country, acknowledge, uphold and promote basic human rights as embodied in the Constitution of South Africa, commit themselves, therefore, to do all within their power in the exercising of their professional duties to act in accordance with the ideals of their profession as expressed in this code. And finally, act in a proper and becoming way such that their behaviour does not bring the teaching profession into disrepute. There's an interesting mix of rhetoric in this section, including quite a few normative statements and a message about who the ideal teacher is supposed to be. Some of those statements seem relatively uncontroversial. For example, the third one, that teachers must uphold the highest law in the land, namely the Constitution. I'd recommend that you do check out at minimum the Bill of Rights, which is the section 2 of the Constitution, which I've posted for you in the Vula folder. In fact, it's a good idea in general to buy yourself a little pocket copy of the Constitution to keep in your classroom as a teacher. It's a useful teaching device, as well as a reference for yourself in any conflict or uncertainty. Even if the laws can't tell us what is right and wrong in every situation, it is very useful to know what your and your students' constitutional rights are. But some of the other statements in this first part are a bit empty on specifics and try to insinuate what kind of character Sace believes a teacher should be. Concepts like noble or quality have quite a lot built into them. I mean, noble means having higher moral principles. Given, though, however, that what higher moral principles means is quite open to interpretation, as we've been discussing for the last 4 sections. The problem is that this word looks strong on the surface, but could be filled with almost any meaning that the reader chooses. Similarly goes for statements like ideals or not bringing the profession into disrepute. There's a lot of room for interpretation here. That's not necessarily a bad thing. What disrepute entails should be contextual and informed by the specificities of any accusation to the contrary. But neither the words noble, nor respectable, nor quality are going to provide guidance for teachers in dilemmas. For me, it is the second point in this subsection that causes me trouble. It reads the attitude, dedication, self-discipline, ideals, training, and conduct of the teaching profession determine the quality of education in this country. But there are many, many other factors that also determine the quality of education, beyond just teachers' attitudes and dedication. Most of these factors are outside of a school's control. So for me, this phrase seems to position teachers' attitudes as the only thing that matters for schooling. And conversely, that if education is of poor quality, that it is attributable to a teacher with a bad attitude. Unfortunately, there are lots of people who buy into this discourse. Tropes of lazy or indolent teachers are common, and unfortunately, quite misinformed. There's also not a little ego built into this. It decontextualizes teachers' work as if they are somehow above and outside of the schools, communities, and conditions in which they teach. That's really not the case in practice. But at least Clause 4 gives us a little leeway that teachers don't have to be saints, or worse, martyrs, because it uses the phrase to do all within their power. As we will discuss in later sections, what power teachers do have is very dependent on their context of their work, as well as the broader social terrain of power. Let's press on and see if this code can give us something a little bit more concrete and useful to work with. The next section is the longest in the code and relates to the interaction between educator and learners. We're going to take it in 3 chunks. The first chunk says that an educator respects the dignity, beliefs, and constitutional rights of learners, and in particular children, which includes the right to privacy and confidentiality. Teachers also must acknowledge the uniqueness, individuality, and specific needs of each learner, guiding and encouraging each to realize his or her potentialities. A teacher strives to enable learners to develop a set of values consistent with the fundamental rights contained in the Constitution. A teacher exercises authority with compassion, avoids any form of humiliation, and refrains from any form of abuse, whether physical or psychological, refrains from improper physical contact with learners, and promotes gender equality. Okay, so most of these are really easy to get behind. And even when the substance of their enactment is not always totally clear, maybe that's appropriate to enable a teacher to exercise professional judgment. For example, what might be the specific needs of each learner and their potentialities. Refraining from abuse and promoting gender equality are, I'm pretty sure we'd agree, good things. And they sit comfortably with the Constitution and its bedrock principle of equal moral worth, which is the idea that all people are equally worthy of the same rights, treatment, and consideration. But there's one niggle in this first chunk, which is the first clause. You can't guarantee a student confidentiality if they disclose abuse to you. Under the Children's Act, you have to report it to your principal and complete what's called a Form 22. Even if the child has asked you, please don't tell anyone. I've listed section 110 of the South African Children's Act here, which states broadly that reporting of abused or neglected child or a child in need of care and protection requires any adult in a relation of care, and the list is long. You can see that it includes teachers on line 3. Any teacher or any of these other adults who on reasonable grounds concludes that a child has been abused in a manner causing physical injury or has been sexually abused or deliberately neglected must report that conclusion in a prescribed form to a designated child protection organisation, the Provincial Department of Social Development, or the police. There are general regulations attached to that Act, and Clause 33 from that says how you should go about reporting this, which basically says, once again, that if you on reasonable grounds conclude that a child has been abused in this manner, including emotionally abused, I might add, you need to fill in a form that looks as much like a Form 22 as possible to the best of your ability and include as much information as you have available to you on that form. Form 22 is also in the Ruler folder and attached as an addendum to the Children's Act. You can download a copy very easily. We'll look in section 6 as to whether filling in Form 22 really constitutes a sufficient ethical response to abuse. But for now, you need to know that you have to fill it in and report, or you will be in breach of the Children's Act. But based on the Sace Code of Conduct, unfortunately, you cannot always give your students confidentiality or privacy. Now let's look at the second chunk of this part of the code that relates to learners. It says An educator refrains from courting learners from any school, refrains from any form of sexual harassment, physical or otherwise, refrains from exposing and or displaying any form of pornographic material to learners and or keeping the same in his or her possession, and refrains from any form of sexual relationship with learners from any school. You would think that the part about not having relations of a sexual nature with students is pretty obvious. But particularly high school teachers, do be prepared. You need to keep very firm boundaries in this regard. Firstly, teenagers are strange beasts, and they are full of hormones. For students to develop a crush on a teacher or otherwise experience contradictory or confused feelings for a senior adult in a relation of authority and care over them is not unusual. This is further conflated by the fact that not all students in high schools in South Africa are minors. Unfortunately, we have a high repetition rate in South Africa, and our high schools include many young adults over the age of 18. But this does not make sexual relations between a student and a teacher okay. The power relations are not compatible with willing and total consent. Unfortunately, that might not mean that students feel that it is not okay. And so you as the teacher need to keep very clear and firm boundaries. If at any point you feel a student may be inclined towards you, you must take extra precautions. For example, try not to be in a room alone with them if you can avoid it, especially before and after school. It should hopefully go without saying that you may never reciprocate. It's neither legal nor ethical. There's no grey area here. And female teachers, this does apply to you too. But the rest of this section relating to learners is not quite as clear and unambiguous. It continues by saying that teachers must use appropriate language and behaviour in his or her interactions with learners, act in such a way as to elicit respect from them, take reasonable steps to ensure their safety. Do not abuse the position you hold for financial, political, or personal gain, and is not negligent or indolent in the performance of his or her professional duties, along with recognising, where appropriate, learners as partners in education. So there are some words here that are again open to interpretation. For example, acting and speaking in a way so as to elicit respect from learners, or not being negligent or indolent. Ideals of respect and what constitutes negligence or indolence are very open-ended and contextual. Here's an example. I am, as a teacher and a person, someone who tends to curse quite a lot. Some people find this brash and offensive, others find it honest and less pretentious. On occasion, I have let rip an expletive in front of my high school students. In one case, I kicked my foot and I hurt my toes, and I let out a swear word. Now, have I behaved in a way as not to elicit respect from my students? It's an interesting case to consider. For some students, yes, but others found it made me more relatable and less snobbish. In discussions with my students, we would realize that we had very diverse ideas about what constitutes respectable. For me, it was about how I treated people. Did I give you kindness and consideration? Did I not demean you? And less about never swearing. We contrasted this in our discussions with a teacher who might never swear, but would also be demeaning or uncaring towards students. But then again, you see this as contextual, because if I was a foundation phase teacher, I would be a lot more careful. Children at that age have less ability to choose for themselves whether they pick up words from the teacher, as compared to my burly 17-year-old in a high school, who could probably swear my socks off. I would, however, contest if anyone was to accuse me of being unethical for cursing when I kicked my foot. Probably the most ethically aligned clause in this section of the code is the idea that students are also people and capable of participating as co-authors and meaning makers in their own learning experience. This is a great framing of how to execute an ethics of care for them as humans in progress. This clause articulates the difference between teaching to and teaching with our students. So you can see from this total part of the code that there are aspects that are very clear, for example, no inappropriate relations with students, and that are a bit fuzzier. What constitutes being respectable? The next two parts relate to how educators relate with parents and community. With parents, an educator, where appropriate, recognizes parents as partners in education and promotes a harmonious relationship with them, refrains from offering a bribe to any form of parents, and does what is practically possible to keep parents or caregivers adequately and timeously informed about the well-being and progress of the learner. This seems relatively innocuous. Work with parents as much as you can. Don't bribe them, obviously, and try to keep them in the loop where possible. But there's a running joke amongst teachers that you always wonder what is up with a student who is struggling or acting out in class until parent-teachers evening, when all is revealed. When you meet the caregivers of your students, a lot about them falls into place about why they are who they are. Remember, you have your students for 5 to 6 hours in a day, and the other 18 to 19 hours they are with other people. The point being, what being partners in education means will be very different from caregiver to caregiver. And again, you need to use your professional judgment here. But with communities, an educator recognizes that an education institution serves that community and then acknowledges that there will be differing customs, codes, and beliefs in the community. An educator should also conduct him or herself in a manner that does not show disrespect to that community's values, customs, and norms. This can be a lot more tricky to navigate. Let me give you some examples, and you'll have to deploy your moral conscience as you go along. Here are a few tensions and contradictions I experienced in my last teaching role as an example. As a middle-class white person, I had to be very careful about different ideas and ideals of respect. For example, using terms like mama or tata for parents and elders in the community. Other forms of customs and codes included, for example, not looking people in the eyes, which took some unlearning from me. Or accepting when the abaqueta had to leave my class and then had to catch up on their mislearning. Even selecting stories in light of different cultural norms when choosing English readings. For example, I love owls, but they're a bad omen in isiXhosa culture. My colleagues wanted to choose Harry Potter books for readings, but I needed to have a serious rethink about how this might be received in a community where witchcraft had a very different meaning to what it means to us steeped in Western culture. And of course, all of this is on the backdrop of the power structures in place that I have described before. Having said which, there were community customs and norms which I could not accept being imposed upon myself. For example, parents felt that corporal punishment was appropriate and necessary, and I did not. I'm also an atheist and was working in a very overtly Christian environment. And this was all fine so long as we could respect each other's religious positions. But there were times when we had to have extremely delicate conversations, especially with my students, when they could not distinguish between atheism and immorality. For example, they assumed atheism was synonymous with forms of witchcraft and or Satanism. I also could not condone or accept judgments made on my character or value as a person premised on my childlessness, even though I could respect that bearing children was an important cultural norm for my students and their families. So these were the interesting cross threads running through the multi-stranded relationship I had with the community across culture, class, religion, race, and other issues, which could not be reduced to simple positions. These complexities primarily hinged on being able to be respectful of differences without necessarily agreeing on those differences. And in the cases of things like corporal punishment, where those beliefs are in contradiction to the Constitution, one's obligation to uphold that Constitution as a teacher takes precedence. Moving on, the next section relates to how teachers should interact with his or her colleagues. It says that an educator refrains from undermining the status and authority of their colleagues, respects various responsibilities assigned to those colleagues and the authority that arises from that to ensure the smooth running of the school, uses proper procedures to address issues of professional incompetence or misbehavior, promotes gender equality and refrains from sexual harassment, physical or otherwise, of his or her colleagues, uses appropriate language and behavior in interactions with colleagues, and avoids any form of humiliation or abuse towards colleagues. Again, nothing too contradictory here, although several terms are open for people to fill them with meaning, for example, appropriate language and behavior. But number 3 can become sticky if incompetence or misbehavior is from a senior member of staff and the proper procedures require their cooperation, especially as a junior member of staff. In the event you find a senior member of staff is treating you inappropriately, I would recommend that you follow up all verbal conversations with a polite email, confirming the content of the conversation. This makes sure everything is in writing and also places onus on that person to refute your interpretation of the conversation if they want to. The second thing I would recommend, and this is only in extreme situations of harassment or bullying or gross misconduct. If you find yourself on the wrong end of a power asymmetry with a senior colleague who is behaving in this way, you can record a verbal conversation with your phone. This is admissible in the case of a dispute without informing them, but in fact, I've found it's even more effective to calmly and politely tell the other person that you are going to record the conversation and will happily share it with them if they so wish, so that everyone has a record of what is being discussed. This normally gets a person who is behaving inappropriately to dial it down a notch or 3. In a nutshell, this section is all very nice and good on the surface, but it really doesn't reflect the kind of micro-politicking that can happen in staff rooms and schools, especially schools that are fraught due to under-resourcing and the resultant stresses. Even well-resourced schools, though, are not immune from staff room politics. The golden rule: never lose your cool. And now we move on to the section that describes the relations of a teacher with the profession. It says an educator acknowledges that exercising their professional duties occurs with a context that requires teamwork, behaves in a way that enhances the dignity and status of the profession, keeps abreast of trends and developments and promotes ongoing development of teaching, accepts that they have a professional obligation towards education and induction of new members, refrains from contravention of any regulations and statutes relative to the code, refrains from indulging or being in possession of intoxicating, illegal and or unauthorized substances, including alcohol and drugs, at least while within the school premises or while on duty, refrains from carrying or keeping dangerous weapons in the school without prior consent, and refrains from engaging in illegal activities. Again, the devil's in the detail here. For example, according to the code, this means that staff cannot have a glass of wine at the matric ball. And unfortunately, what constitutes a dangerous weapon is also not clear. While no one is advocating the teachers should bring guns to school, I've had first-hand experience of the use of normal school objects as dangerous weapons. Should a teacher's lunch cutlery, for example, be considered in this category? For example, in the United Kingdom, minors are forbidden from purchasing any sharp objects in shops, even scissors, to avoid youth knife fights. But in general, this is deemed a bridge too far by the general public. Rather, issues around bringing weapons onto school premises should rather ask, what are the conditions that might make people want to carry weapons at all, and are they being addressed? Some of the other issues around legality are open to interpretation here. Technically, the 9th point means a teacher who got a speeding fine has contravened the code, as has the teacher whose car license disc is overdue. Rather, that teachers need to be explicitly reminded to not break the law is a somewhat empty statement. No one should break the law if they can help it, unless the law itself is unethical. For example, the way that teachers in the past broke the law in order to protest the unethicalness of apartheid, Or right now, the way that protesters across the United States are breaking curfew laws that have been imposed to quell the uprisings over the death of Floyd George. It is called ethical illegality. In general, this section is very loose. Induct the newcomers, keep abreast of developments, don't bring the profession into disrepute. These are all very vague statements. We're almost there. Sorry, this stuff can get quite dry. But this is the second last part of the code, and it details the relation between a teacher and their employer. It says that an educator recognizes their employer as a partner in education, acknowledges certain responsibilities and authorities are vested with that employer through legislation, and that the educator will serve the employer to the best of their ability. That the educator refrains from discussing confidential or official matters with unauthorized persons, and must inform or declare his or her business interests to the employer prior to executing them. Although the concept of a partner in the first part is a bit of a stretch given the power relations between an employer and an employee, the idea of cooperation and consultation between teachers and their employers is definitely something we want, and it would probably make for a much more pleasant and more effective teaching and learning environment. Clause 3 poses some interesting ethical challenges, though, because this means that if a teacher acting out of conscience discloses internals going on to the press, for example, as a whistleblower, she or he could potentially be hauled up on a disciplinary. The line between discretion and allowing processes to run their course versus transparency and responsibility to the broader public is not addressed at all in this code. In general, the code aligns with the employer on issues of contradiction and conflict, and it makes no reference to teachers who might act insubordinate for a higher good or ideal. And that, if this was demonstrated to be the case, that the teacher should not be subject to disciplinary measures. Say, for example, a teacher calls the press to say that she's aware her school's governing body has just transferred a colleague suspected of sexual misconduct to another school, opting to let them go quietly rather than fully sanctioning them and subjecting them to the full consequences of the law. The school opted for a hush-hush option because it feared reputational damage from the news that a sex offender was amongst their staff. Technically, the whistleblower teacher could be sanctioned for doing the right thing. And if you think that this is hypothetical, I recommend you listen to the 4-episode podcast entitled My Only Story. In it, the author survivor Dion Wiggett lays out the scandal of his own rape at the hands of a teacher. What's worse is not just that the senior education official abused many boys at different schools over a long period of time around South Africa, but that the schools knew about it and they did nothing. And finally, the last section of the Sace Code of Conduct binds teachers to the code by saying they must make every effort to familiarize themselves with it, comply with it, disclose information relevant to the council, inform the council of breaches to the best of his or her knowledge, cooperate with the council to the best of his or her ability, and comply with procedures and requirements, including registration procedures, disciplinary procedures, and the payment of fees for registration. Again, this is all more bureaucratic than ethical. What's interesting is whether the SACE actually has the capacity to deal with every contravention of the code, since Clause 4 implies all infractions must be reported. As of May 2020, the SACE was investigating 633 cases. From the 2021 report to the Basic Education Portfolio Committee, held on the 12th of May, the SACE indicated that it was having trouble processing all of the complaints of unethical conduct against teachers. In particular, since provinces are teachers' employers, teachers found guilty of contraventions would switch provinces without their records following them, and in this way they regained entry into the profession. SACE also reported that parents and caregivers do not always allow their children to give evidence, and employers do not always press charges, which makes following up on issues of serious misconduct a lot more difficult. So, using our sections laid out and our ideas laid out in the last section, it is quite clear that most of this code is more about the socialization, as Bauman put it, than about exercising moral conscience in difficult circumstances. Nonetheless, agree with it or not, you do need to be familiar with this code as part of your Sace registration. Hopefully, this critical reading has alerted you about what the code is good for, namely legally covering yourself, and what it is not good for, which is actually helping you to think through practice ethically. Well done for making it through this really dry section. We'll get on to some more meaty, chewy dilemmas next time.